The Quarterly, the Gospel of Mark, Lesson 11, Mark 14, 1-25. Eating with Jesus. The hostility of the Jewish leaders to Jesus has been evident for some time in Mark's Gospel. In Mark 12, Jesus silenced all their attempts to entrap him, leaving them feeling enraged and impotent. Now their anger crystallized into a plot against his life, just as Jesus had predicted. Mark 14:1, C 10:33. However, they needed an opportunity to arrest Jesus out of sight of the crowds thronging Jerusalem for the Passover, so they didn't cause a riot. Judas's offer to betray Jesus provided them with the opportunity that they sought, verses 10-11. In the midst of this gathering storm, 2 meals with Jesus are recorded, whose tenderness shines all the more brightly against such a dark backdrop. The first features a woman who broke an expensive jar of perfume and anointed the head of Jesus, a shocking display of extravagance and shameless devotion that Jesus described as a preparation for his burial, verses 3-9. And then Jesus shared the Last Supper with his disciples, the final Passover meal of the old order, which was now transformed into the Lord's Supper, an ongoing sacrament for the new covenant people of God, verses 12-25. Everything was now prepared for the climax of the gospel story, which would take place in Jesus' death and resurrection. The Passover festival attracted many pilgrims to Jerusalem. Devout adult males were required to attend the major festivals in Jerusalem 3 times a year, Deuteronomy 16:16. And though that would have been impossible for many who lived at a distance, the city was crammed with people at these celebrations, and religious fervor was at its height. It wouldn't have taken much of a spark to create an explosion, and the Jewish authorities were eager not to provide that spark unnecessarily, verse 2. But for all their plotting, they were not in control of when Jesus would die. The sovereign Lord had already determined the day and the hour. The scene cuts from Jerusalem, where the leaders were plotting Jesus' death, to Bethany, a village just outside Jerusalem on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, verse 3. This is where Jesus was staying during the festival, rather than in the city itself, chapter 11, verses 11-12. Jesus attended a feast at the house of Simon the leper, so specified not only to distinguish him from all those other Simons in Mark's account, but probably also to suggest that he was one of many who had been healed by Jesus of that devastating and defiling disease. Without Jesus' intervention, Simon would not have been able to enter Bethany, let alone host a feast there. While the disciples were reclining at the table to eat, as was the custom for special meals in those days, a woman entered the room with an alabaster jar of nard, a very expensive perfume, which would almost certainly have been a family heirloom, verse 3. She proceeded to break the jar and anoint Jesus with it, pouring all of it over his head, rather than simply smearing on a small amount of the costly fluid. This was a lavish outpouring of respect, far beyond anything that might be expected under normal circumstances. Perhaps unsurprisingly, some of the disciples were offended by her action, which they saw as wasteful, verse 4. The ointment could instead have been sold, they thought, fetching up to 300 denarii, verse 5. Now, since a denarius was the standard daily wage for a laborer, 300 denarii represents the best part of a year's wages for most ordinary people, an astonishing sum to squander on such a momentary display of affection, when there were so many poor people all around them without food or shelter or adequate clothing, verse 5. The disciples interpreted her action not as a gesture of deep respect and generosity, but as a waste of valuable resources that could have served a more functional purpose. Jesus spoke up to defend the woman, verse 6, pointing out that her action did not affect the disciples' ability to use their own resources to help the poor. It's not as if there would ever be a shortage of poor people to feed either, verse 7. Rather, Jesus commended the woman's action as being a timely expression of her love and faith. Unlike the poor, Jesus would not always be with them. And by this action, the woman was doing more than honoring him. She was preparing his body for his impending death. Verse 8. As Jesus said, she has done what she could. Verse 8. She took what she had and spent it all on Jesus, without reserve or holding anything back. At the end of the episode, the spotlight returns again to the chief priests, as Judas came and handed them the opportunity that they sought to capture Jesus without a fuss, in exchange for money, verses 10 to 11. We're not told explicitly what Judas's motivation to betray Jesus was, and whether it was financial or other. Although John does tell us that Judas used to help himself from the money that the disciples collected to aid the poor. John 12:6. Whatever his motivation, Judas had gone from following Jesus as a disciple to becoming so disillusioned that it made sense to him to sell out his former friend. The contrast between Judas, one of the 12 chosen disciples who then betrayed Jesus, and the unnamed woman who anointed Jesus to prepare him for his death and burial, is comprehensive. She gave a priceless gift to Jesus out of a heart of love, while he sold Jesus for the price of a slave out of anger and greed. On the following day, the Thursday of the Passover festival, when the Passover meal was to be consumed, Jesus sent 2 disciples ahead of him to make the appropriate preparations. Verse 12. The disciples were sent into the city, seemingly at random, looking for an unusual sight, a man carrying a water jar. Verse 13. Generally, fetching water would have been considered women's work. When they found the man, they were told to approach him and make what must have seemed like an unreasonable demand, that he should give them a guest room where the disciples might prepare the Passover, at a time when every square inch in the city would have been packed with pilgrims. Just as when Jesus requisitioned a donkey for his triumphal entry into Jerusalem in Mark 11, verses 1 to 6, everything transpired exactly as Jesus had said it would. Jesus is once again demonstrated to be a true prophet, able to predict the future, in which every detail is under the Lord's control. In the evening, once the Passover meal had been prepared, Jesus arrived with the disciples. Verse 12. The note that they were reclining at table highlights the comparison between what's about to happen at this meal and what happened the previous night in Bethany, in verse 3. In contrast to the woman's expensive love gift, Jesus announced that one of the 12 would betray him, verse 18. He'd previously spoken about being betrayed, chapter 9:31. But this was the first time he implicated one of his own disciples. And it was far from immediately self-evident to the disciples who that betrayer must be. Each sorrowfully regarded themselves as a possible candidate. Verse 19. In the ancient world, eating a meal with someone formed a sacred bond. To betray a person after eating their food was an unthinkable act. The betrayal of Jesus, wicked though it was, would not subvert God's sovereign plan for the course of history. Rather, it was a necessary part of Jesus' story, as had been written in the Old Testament scriptures. Verse 21. Psalm 41:10 anticipated just such a betrayal. Yet woe to the one who would betray the Lord of glory in this way. It would be better for him if he had not even been born. Verse 21. Though one of those sharing this meal would betray Jesus, for the remainder of the disciples, It was the beginning of a new sacrament. In the Old Covenant, families quite literally ate the body of the Passover lamb as they celebrated their deliverance from Egypt that was signed and sealed in its blood. Exodus 12. Now Jesus called his disciples to recognize him as their Passover lamb. 1 Corinthians 5:7. The one through whom their deliverance had come. Eating his body under the sign of unleavened bread and drinking his blood through the sign of the cup of wine would commemorate his death and celebrate their communion both with Jesus and with one another. Verses 22 to 24. It was a visual and acted out reminder of his body, broken for them, and his blood poured out, just like the blood of the burnt offerings and peace offerings in the Sinai covenant. Exodus 24, verses 5 to 8. Jews who were distant from the holy city customarily concluded their Passover celebration with the cry, "Next year in Jerusalem." As he drank this cup, however, Jesus anticipated drinking it for the next time in the kingdom of God at his triumphant return. Verse 25. Application questions. The woman who anointed Jesus did what she could. What can you do to honor Jesus? 2. How do you harmonize Jesus' words, "You always have the poor with you," in Mark 14:7, with "There will be no poor among you," in Deuteronomy 15:7? 3. How does the Lord's Supper connect with the sacrifices of the Old Covenant? 4. Why is the Lord's Supper an important part of the Christian life?